Hey everyone, it's Amit. So today what I wanted to talk about is Bitcoin. So I know, before you just click away, right? Because there's so much other content out there on Bitcoin. What I specifically wanted to talk about is why I think it's a good time, if you are an owner of Bitcoin, to maybe take your profits and run. If you aren't an owner of Bitcoin and attempted to get in because you just heard about Bitcoin crossing $25,000 of Bitcoin, well, it may be an opportunity to not get tempted by that and just hold off for a few minutes, take into account some of the considerations in this video, and then make an assessment on whether you want to partake in it or whether you may be able to identify certain other opportunities, which I'll talk about towards the tail end of this video as well. So before we get too far into it, this is a personal finance channel focused on helping you make smarter financial choices. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to give you six reasons why I think it's a good time to take your profits and get out of Bitcoin or not engage in Bitcoin at all. So let me frame this up for a bit, okay? I know everyone's talking about Bitcoin. The question really is it even worth the time to talk about Bitcoin? Okay, I'm going to give you some numbers here why I think this whole Bitcoin thing is just like a media craze, right? It's just been pushed by the media so much that we're covering it on every single day on CNBC and whatever the topic area you want to talk about, right? They're covering it so often and it's just hyped this thing up so much. But let me put some numbers in front of you so you can kind of put this whole thing in perspective. At its current valuation, Bitcoin has a market cap of about $350 billion. It seems like a lot. You're like, whoa, that's a lot of money. It is definitely a legitimate topic, right? There should be so much coverage on it. It makes a lot of sense. But no. That's not the case. Bitcoin is usually or quite often compared to gold. Okay, it's considered an inflation hedge, right? And when you think about gold, the market for gold is $10 trillion. This is with a T, okay? Bitcoin 350 billion, gold 10 trillion. And then if you think about it from the context of the broad-based S&P 500, that has a market cap of 31.61 trillion. I'm just going to pause there so you can think about it, okay? 350 billion, 10 trillion, 31.6 trillion. The S&P 500 market is literally 100 times bigger. Like if you think about the FANG stocks, right? Now that's become a household thing. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. If you think about that, and even Microsoft, you throw that in there if you want to, right? 5 out of those 6 companies has a bigger market cap than Bitcoin. The exception being Netflix. It's just so many zeros that we're talking about here, and people can easily run up to this conclusion that, oh, 350 billion, it's so worth all this interest. But let me tell you something, right? People in the financial markets on a day-to-day basis are not all that concerned about Bitcoin at this point in time, right? I know it's a big thing in people's houses at this stage, right? People are constantly thinking about it, but nope, it's not that big a deal. But with that said, I know there's a lot of hype about it. So let's talk about it, right, in terms of what are the 6 reasons why I think that we shouldn't spend too much time on this. And if you're an owner of it, get the hell out of it, okay? So here we go. So the first reason why I think Bitcoin is so overvalued, right, and why it makes sense to get out of it, is it's purely speculative. It's purely speculative, okay? And what I mean by that is nobody has an idea in terms of how much this thing is actually worth. I'll show you articles here that talks about Bitcoin. Oh, it's headed up to 400,000. Oh, this person is saying Bitcoin is headed up to 300,000. Whoa. This guy is saying Bitcoin should be worth over $1 million in 2021. Whoa, this guy is saying that, oh, it's potentially got a growth of about 100,000. You know, so it just depends, right? People are just using this back of the napkin type of calculation, thinking about supply and demand, right? And basically forecasting where this thing is going to end up. But that is not the way to essentially value anything, right? Everything should have some level of an intrinsic value, whether it's gold, whether it's US dollars, whether it's any currency of your choice. It's got some intrinsic value. It's got to be worth something. It can't just be, oh, just because this guy's asking for this and this guy's willing to pay for this, let's just put it as this valuation, and then, oh, let's just project out that this demand is going to continue to go on forever, and because of that, this value is going to continue to increase. So Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. It's just digital, okay? It's just based on people propping this thing up, and people are just rushing to it with this thing that it's going to go on forever. But let me tell you something. This has happened in the tulips back in the day, right? This has happened numerous times where that cannot be the basis in terms of how do you assess what something is actually worth. And that is where Bitcoin is currently, and that is what is currently being valued at, right? It's being valued at nothing. It's being valued at just whatever people think, right? You could have a big investor come in tomorrow, say he's going to put $100 million into Bitcoin, boom, more demand, right? And it's just going to keep going up, right? And then that large investor is just going to take his money out, book his gains, and call it a day, right? While you're left there holding the bag with more Bitcoin. So that's the first reason why. The second reason why is regulators. Okay, even though this is a very small component of the financial markets, right? What's happening now is there is some level of interest associated with FinCEN, right, which is a regulatory body that's interested in knowing where this Bitcoin is actually going, right? Where it's actually trading hands and knowing your customer and so on and so forth. The SEC has some level of interest in it, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, which basically regulates most of the things that you see traded on the markets, right? Whether it's stocks or currencies or bonds or whatever, the SEC has some level of involvement associated with all of that, right? And of course, even the IRS, right? People want to tax the heck out of these things. And anyway, so there is some level of interest associated with that. Now, in the current stage, this level of interest is almost non-existent. And that's what's driving this value of Bitcoin up. The reality of it is, once you get these assets regulated, right, it's going to create some level of problem. Right? We don't know what the scale of this problem is going to be. It all depends on what this extent of regulation is actually going to be, right? But it could be very significant, and it could just bludgeon the valuation of Bitcoin, and it's going to kill its price. Okay, so just be aware that it has raised the ire of some of the regulatory agencies. I think we're going to see more traction into that space in 2021, which is going to create more interest or from the regulators, but also more cause for concern when it comes to the value of Bitcoin. The third reason why is very much closely linked to the first area that I talked about, okay? It is not being viewed as a store of value, right? You go to the store tomorrow, right? You know what your dollar is essentially worth, or your rupee, or your pound, or whatever, right? You know what it's worth. You know what it's probably going to buy, right? I know that's not necessarily the case in certain other countries which have significant amount of inflation that is happening literally on a daily basis, right? Think about Venezuela and this and that. Think about all these other countries that are just like ridiculous in terms of how their fiscal monetary policies essentially are. But in some of the more stable countries, right, you know what your dollar is going to buy tomorrow. You know what your pound is going to buy tomorrow. Bitcoin, you have no idea, right? It could be up another 500 tomorrow. It could be down, right? We have no idea what Bitcoin is actually worth. If you don't know what Bitcoin is actually worth, it cannot be a store of value, okay? So that's the third reason in terms of why I think this kind of like run up as it relates to Bitcoin is going to end. The fourth reason why is the government is now interested in cryptos. The Chinese government has talked about it. Jerome Powell in the US Fed has talked about it. I'm sure other countries are going to be speaking about it as well and are probably working on it if they haven't already, right? They understand the potential of digital currency, and what they want to do is now create their own digital currency. This may result in Bitcoin basically being further delegitimized, okay? So what might happen here is countries may say, no, you need to take into account our digital currency of our country, and all these other currencies are essentially going to be potentially even illegal. Now, I know there'll be a lot of naysayers out there that'll say, well, if there's going to be all this, illegality associated with Bitcoin, it's just going to create more demand for it, right? People are going to know that it's the right thing. Well, let me tell you something, okay? Like, typically what happens is when things are illegal, right, the demand for it is shot. Yes, people will continue to engage in it, right? But the demand for it is naturally going to be shot, okay? It's going to go down. So there's not going to be as much buzz as it would be with the digital currency of whatever country that you're in. So there is going to be a lot of that type of pressure as well, but we're literally seeing it, right? We're literally seeing China. China is further along in the process, and they're developing their own digital currency. So it's going to potentially take away some of the demand associated with Bitcoin. People typically are not interested in engaging in illegal activity. Typically, right? So you don't want this currency out there, or you're definitely going to drop the demand for it as countries roll out, if they do roll out their own digital currencies. So that's the reason why. The next reason, the fifth reason, is inflation. Everyone's run into Bitcoin because, not everyone, most people are running towards Bitcoin because of the countries or the individual governments, the Federal Reserve or the monetary, whatever it is, right? Basically, them all pumping money, right? They're pumping money because they're trying to navigate through this global health crisis that we're in, right? And make sure that we don't come into a grinding halt, and that's what's basically happening. People are generally thinking that this is going to result in inflation. When it results in inflation, the dollar or the currency is going to basically get devalued, and Bitcoin is going to be the great hedge for it. It's going to be the savior, essentially, for all intents and purposes. And the reality of that is a couple of things, okay? Mainly, that there's no evidence of inflation. There's no evidence of inflation. Yes, we've had a small uptick lately, right? But we pumped out money back in 2008 during the housing crisis. There was no inflation subsequent to that, right? There's no meaningful inflation at this point in time. We keep talking about it, but none of it is manifesting itself. It's been over 10, 12 years, right, since we started pumping money into the markets. Okay, so just another reason in terms of why this whole inflation thing may be a little bit, a little exaggerated, if you will, right? Like I think there may be at some point in time some inflation that does happen as it relates to this, and when that does happen, there are other inflation hedges. If your concern is inflation, there are cheaper inflation hedges that are essentially proven out, and I'll talk about that towards the tail end of this video. The sixth reason why is in terms of adoption. So yeah, I know there's a lot of significant amount of adoption in the US. That's wonderful, right? That's great and dandy and all that. But that level of global adoption is not there, okay? You'll have people out there talking about, oh, some of these other currencies with these significant inflation and, but you can't value or you have no trust or confidence in what their federal governments are essentially doing, or their equivalent of the Treasury or their equivalent of the Federal Reserve or whatever. You have no confidence in terms of what they're doing, so those currencies are just basically like out of control, right? So it's hyperinflation, and cryptocurrency would be a good baseline for some of that, okay? So I'll tell you something, right? In terms of what those countries are, and this is no offense to anybody, okay, but relative to some of the countries in the Western world, that is the poorer or, more developing world, if you will. And what that basically means is, do you think a poor country is going to be able to afford $25,000 for a Bitcoin, right? Or some fractional percentage of that particular Bitcoin? And on top of that, do you think some of these people in these countries are going to have all these digital wallets and are going to be investing in that sort of thing to result in incremental adoption of it? Right? The reality of it is that's not going to be the case, right? I know sitting out in the Western world, people are like, oh, I'll just spend X amount of dollars on a digital wallet, and then, I'll just go out and buy $500 of Bitcoin. I'll do this and I'll do that. But that is not the case when it comes to poor countries. Those countries which have hyperinflation, those countries which have those types of issues, I think people are more interested in how do they get a loaf of bread or how do they get a gallon of milk, rather than how do I get a digital wallet such that I can effectively trade in Bitcoin. So that's the sixth reason why. Okay, so those are the 6 reasons in terms of why I think that it might be time for you to consider or evaluate your investment thesis as it relates to Bitcoin. Does it make sense to continue to go down this path? Does it make sense to potentially, pack it up, take your profits and get out at least, right? And let your original principal potentially run if you wanted to, right? Or give you some moment of pause in terms of your other investment options. Now, as I said earlier, right, there are other opportunities out there outside of Bitcoin. If your main concern is inflation, there is one proven tool, right, that has basically been an inflation hedge over the last hundreds of years. Okay, it's gold. Right? So I know gold does not experience the same run-up as Bitcoin. Okay? I know that gold is not potentially acting in the same way as it historically has as it relates to an inflation hedge, but that's probably because there's no real indication of any inflation. Okay? That's probably the reason why. But at any rate, gold is so much cheaper than Bitcoin. If you want an inflation hedge, gold is probably the preferred option, and you can buy gold off the exchange. Just the ticker symbol is GLD. The other inflation hedge, if you're interested in playing that game, right, and are also willing to take on a bit more risk, but if you are an investor in Bitcoin, you probably are willing to do so because volatility clearly doesn't matter, right, is consider silver. SLV is the ticker for that. Silver is a good inflation hedge as well. It's more volatile than gold, right? It's less volatile than Bitcoin, but I think most things are for all intents and purposes, and they're significantly cheaper. Gold is significantly cheaper than Bitcoin, and silver is significantly cheaper than gold. Opportunities, right? These are other opportunities that are out there. I have nothing to do with gold and nothing to do with silver, none of this stuff, right? So there's no like personal vested interest for me in terms of these things moving up or down or whatever. I don't really care, right? But if you're worried about inflation, if you're worried about volatility, if you're worried about these things, there are proven asset types, gold and silver, right, which have potentially a stronger case than owning something like Bitcoin. So that's just an opportunity there for you to evaluate whether, Bitcoin actually makes sense for you. But in my mind, it's definitely some area of pause, right? If I would be in a position to just take some of my profits or take all of my profits at this point in time and walk away with it. If I'm thinking about entering the Bitcoin market because I'm just so tempted with this run up and this notion of easy money and so on and so forth, right? I may err towards gold or silver as other opportunities to resolve some of my concerns potentially around inflation and so on and so forth. Leave your comments below, right? Leave your comments in terms of why you think Bitcoin is going to have incremental growth in the short term. Leave your comments in terms of why these 6 reasons that I've provided are probably illegitimate, right? Such that a viewer of this video can go through those comments and make up their own investment choices and theses that way, because this is just purely my opinion. Right? This is not meant to be financial advice. This is just supposed to provide some level of thought associated with, whether you should go about in this particular journey. So I hope you enjoyed the contents of this video. If you did, hit the like button and definitely subscribe to the channel as well. And I will see you soon.